Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Hrothsvita of Gandersheim's play Abraham. Now, I've talked about Hrothsvita before in a video about Agape, Kionia, and Irena, or Dulcitius. She's super, super important. Because basically, as far as we know, Hrothsvita reinvents drama as a literary form in Europe after the fall of the Roman Empire, 10th century. About 500 years, almost after. Yeah, about 500 years or so after the fall of the Roman Empire, Hrothsvita seems to reinvent this form. There had, of course, been folk performance in Europe since the fall of the Roman Empire. There's always been folk performance. There will always be folk performance, probably. One hopes. But in terms of like formal theaters and in terms of people writing drama, as far as we know, it just was not happening in Europe until the 10th century when Hrothsvita comes along. And she reads the works of Terence, the Roman playwright, and she kind of says, you know what? I think I can do what Terence does, but for Christian audiences. And so she starts writing these plays. Now, one of the big debates among medievalists, among Hrothsvita scholars, is whether or not these were performed. I'm not an expert on this. This is not my field of study. I'm not super familiar with the debates, but I think Abraham actually gives us some pretty good evidence that, at the very least, this was written for performance. Whether these plays ever actually were performed is, of course, a different question, but there is drama that's written not to be performed, just to be read. It's what's called chamber drama in some cases, or chamber plays. And the Romantics wrote some of these. I think Percy Shelley wrote some famous ones. They're never meant to be performed. They're maybe not even stageable. Abraham is exceedingly stageable. And there are elements of it that sort of tell us how it could be staged. So I think that's really important. I think Abraham is good evidence that, at the very least, Hrothsvita envisioned these being performed. And I suspect they probably were. I think they were probably performed by students at the convent or by nuns. I don't think these were big public performances. I don't think they were like formal theater in the way we would think of formal theater today. But I think they were probably put on in the way that, like, if you go back to early 20th century, like, undergraduate performances of Greek drama or something were put on. I think it's probably something like that. And I will sort of explain why I think this text itself gives us good indications of performance. By the way, I'm reading this out of the Broadview Anthology of Medieval Drama, so that's the translation that I'm working with. Translation originally by Christopher St. John and Richard S. Lambert. So let's talk about the story of Abraham. So Abraham is a hermit. He's an ascetic. These would be people who often lived in caves or out in the Egyptian desert or someplace like this. The early church fathers were big into asceticism. So Abraham and Ephraim, his friend, they're both holy hermits. They have, so Abraham has this niece, granddaughter, somebody. He has a ward, basically. Probably his niece. That makes the most sense, because in order for him to have a granddaughter, he would have had to have sex at least once, have a child, who then had a child subsequently. And the implication is that throughout his life, he has been a celibate, ascetic hermit. But he has this ward. We'll call her a niece. named Mary. Abraham basically sort of gets her, like she becomes his ward when she's very young, about 8 years old. And Abraham discusses with his friend Ephraim what should be done. So he says here, this is the first scene, the opening portion. I have a young orphaned relative, and constant concern for her makes me always worried. Ephraim says, and you who have triumphed over worldliness, what have you to do with its worries? Abraham says, my constant worry is that her great serenity and beauty will be stained by sin. Ephraim says, no one could blame you for being worried. Abraham says, I hope not. Ephraim says, how old is she? Abraham says, she has seen 1 year less than 2 Olympiads. She will be 8 next year. So I guess she's actually 7, sorry. Ephraim says, your ward is very young. Abraham says, that is the reason for my concern. Ephraim says, and where is she staying? Abraham says, in my cell. At her parents' request, I undertook to raise her, but I gave her wealth to the poor. Ephraim says, contempt for the things of this world is proper for a soul that aspires to heaven. Abraham says, most of all, I want her to be married to Christ and devoted to his service. So we get this idea, right? Basically, Ephraim and Abraham decide that the best thing for Mary is to be raised, living in a cave, devoted to Jesus. That's going to be her life. Problem solved. No need to worry about her being stained by sin. And so, they basically sort of raise her in this very holy, ascetic way. Ephraim, at one point early on, so Mary is sort of, she wants to be holy, she wants to be pure and sacred and worthy of God, and Ephraim says, if you remain uncorrupted and virginal, you will be equal to the angels of God. You will finally throw aside the heavy load of the body, rise through the air, cross the ether, travel through the zodiac, never stopping until you are united in the embrace of the Son of the Virgin, in the shining chamber of his mother. Mary says, whoever could find this cheap is a fool. Therefore I despise the world. I deny myself so that I might deserve these joys. This is a very medieval thing. Very medieval, very Saints' Livesy, standard type of stuff. Deny the world, renounce physical pleasure, renounce worldly indulgences, etc., etc., and you will be rewarded in heaven. Great stuff. Gotta love it. The problem becomes that apparently this dude has been coming to... So this is about 10 years later. Mary is 17, 18, somewhere in there. This dude has been coming to the ascetics, dressed as a monk, and apparently he is not a monk. He has been attempting to seduce Mary, which he eventually does. And we get this reported sort of third hand, actually, because Abraham apparently hears it from somebody else after discovering that Mary is gone. So Abraham is telling this to Ephraim. He had these dreams where basically like a serpent ate a dove that was near him. And Ephraim's like, yeah, dude, that's totally fucking obvious. How did you not realize that meant there was something bad going to happen to Mary? And Abraham's like, well, I had this other dream. And it's this whole shtick. So, basically, after Mary is seduced by this dude, she pieces out. She's like, I'm sinful now. I can't be holy. I'm unworthy of God. I'm going to go. Abraham has no idea where she's gone, but he sends his buddy out, not Ephraim, somebody else. He sends his buddy out to go try and find her. That guy finds her. She's working at a brothel, basically. And so Abraham, this old hermit, living in the desert, holy vows, renouncing the world, not eating meat, not drinking wine, not having sex, listening to music, any of that stuff, all the stuff that you want to do in life, but that God hates, apparently. Abraham comes up with this plan that he's going to dress up as a tavern goer, and he's going to go to the brothel where Mary is working. He's going to hire her, and then he's going to convince her to come back to the cells. He's going to convince her basically to give up her life of sin, and that if she repents and does penance, then she can basically get back into God's good graces. So, the sort of issue with Mary ends up becoming she really wants to repent. She wants to be purified. But she doesn't think that she can be worthy of it. And this becomes the sort of crux, because that's a form of despair, right? And one of the things in Christian theology, and this is why suicide is the ultimate mortal sin, the unforgivable sin, is because it represents a form of despair. And despair is blasphemy, because despair is premised on, I am so sinful that not even God can save me. It is a rejection of God's ultimate power. And so this becomes the crux of it. Mary's like, I really want to be saved, but I'm so fucking sinful and stuff. Like, I don't think I can be worthy of it. And she tries to spin it as like, oh, I'm so bad, whereas Abraham's like, no, what you're saying is that God could not save you, and that doubts the power of God. So Abraham says, do not despair, daughter, do not give up, but rise up out of the abyss and fix your spiritual hopes on God. Mary says, the enormity of my sins casts me into a desperate abyss. Abraham says, your sins are certainly grave ones, I admit, but heavenly mercy is greater than all creatures. Now cast away your misery and make use of the short time you have for penance. Where wickedness is abundant, divine grace abounds even more. Mary says, if there was any hope of my deserving forgiveness, I would eagerly throw myself into penance. Abraham says, spare me the exhaustion I have suffered on your behalf and put aside this destructive despair, which is the greatest crime of all. To not have faith in God's forgiveness is to sin irredeemably. So again, we got this notion that Mary needs to turn her back on her life of sin. She needs to come back to the cells. She needs to do penance. She needs to ask God's forgiveness, and she will get it. Yeah, it's a very Catholic thing, right? This idea of you confess, you do penance, and your sins can be forgiven. Very medieval, very Catholic. Standard stuff. So Mary eventually is like, yeah, okay, you've convinced me. I'm going to go back to the cells. I'm going to wear a hair shirt. I'm going to, flagellate myself, whatever it is that medieval people do to do penance. And I'm going to bewail my sins unto the Lord and seek forgiveness. And the final scene, back in Ephraim's cell, back in Ephraim's cell, Ephraim and Abraham are basically like, yeah, man, it's fucking awesome that Mary's back and doing all this penance. Just watching her do penance would soften the most hard-hearted sinner and make them turn to God. So that's the plot of the play, basically. So why do I think that this is a good example of, or why do I think that this is good evidence that this was actually performed, or at least written for performance? Well, so there are these moments where it's clear that there's dramatic action being described. There's a point where Ephraim says, let me see if I can find it. My limbs fail me. And then he sits. There is this cue in the dialogue saying, here's what this character is now doing. My limbs fail me. Oh, I'm experiencing this weakness. That's a performance cue, right? But there's also this bit where Abraham is being helped by his friend Amicus, who's the guy who's gone out and found where Mary is in the brothel. And there's this sort of description. Abraham says, "Bring me an excellent horse and soldier's clothes. I will take off my hermit's clothing and approach her disguised as a lover." Amicus says, I have here everything you need." Abraham says, "Bring me a hat too to cover my tonsure." That's the shaved part of a monk or ascetic's head. Amicus says, "This is particularly necessary to avoid recognition." Abraham says, "Should I take this gold piece to pay the brothel owner?" This is a description of stuff happening on stage, right? Abraham is changing out of his hermit's robes. He presumably puts on this hat. "Should I take this gold piece?" The way that it's said, "should I take this gold piece," suggests he's holding up the gold piece, that there is something visible in hand there. But I think the most compelling point for me in terms of this being written for performance is actually at the end of the play. And this is a pedagogical moment at the end of the play. It's a teaching moment. And so this is the other interpretation of Hrothsvita's drama, is that these are teaching tools, both to teach moral lessons, which is what saints' lives and things like that were about, but also to teach Latin. But this is a moral teaching moment. So Mary is back, she's doing penance. Abraham says, "Whatever I've proposed that she do, however difficult and painful, she has not refused to endure." Ephraim says that is praiseworthy. Abraham says she wears a hair shirt and exhausts herself with fasting and observances, but is forcing her tender body to submit to her will and the strict rules. Ephraim says, "It is only just that the filth of her delights be purged by the bitterness of her suffering." Abraham says, "Whoever hears her weeping is wounded to the heart. Whoever sees her remorse feels remorse themselves." Ephraim says that is how it happens. Abraham says she tries with all her strength to be as great an example of conversion as she was of perdition. So I think this is a really good signal that this was meant for a visual economy, right? Whoever hears her weeping is wounded to the heart. Whoever sees her remorse feels remorse themselves. The medieval period was a very visual time. By and large, people were illiterate. The clergy could read, some nobles, not many, but some nobles could read. There were not, but the peasants, the vast majority of the population, almost entirely illiterate. Literacy rates incredibly low in the medieval period. But the church needed people to know Bible stories, to know moral lessons, to know the teachings of the church. How do you do that? Through visuals, through storytelling. So obviously Sunday sermons and things like this, masses, church services, etc., etc. But this is why you have so much stained glass. This is why stained glass is so important in the medieval period, is because it gives visual depictions of stories. And so I think Hrothsvita is a clever enough person that she's going to realize, if you say, whoever hears her weeping is wounded to the heart, whoever sees her remorse feels remorse themselves, that is a much more powerful moment if behind Abraham and Ephraim we see Mary doing this penance. If we see her in the hair shirt, if we see her weeping and praying and whatever it is, that's much, much more powerful, right? So that tells me that Hrothsvita is envisioning this as being performed, and I would picture downstage, what we would call downstage, sort of front and center, Abraham and Ephraim having this conversation. Upstage, in the back, maybe in a slightly separated off area, we're seeing Mary's penance. And so the idea is not just in an abstract way, whoever hears her weeping is wounded to the heart, whoever sees her remorse feels remorse themselves. It is you, the audience. You are seeing, you are hearing, you should feel remorse for your own sins. I think it's a properly brilliant theatrical moment. Now, the caveat I do want to put on this is that I am reading this as a contemporary theater person, a contemporary drama scholar, and I have the benefit of some 500 plus years of sort of unbroken Western theater tradition, whereas Hrothsvita is working from the texts, whatever texts survived and were available to her from Terence about 5 centuries before, with no unbroken tradition. So it is quite possible that I am interpreting this from the perspective of a modern theater scholar saying, this is what this says to me. If I were staging this, here's what I would do and why. That may actually not be a completely reliable analysis of what Hrothsvita is doing as a writer. But to me, again, I think she's a properly clever person, and I think coming out of an economy in which, out of a sort of intellectual and cultural economy in which visual culture is central to conveying moral lessons, I don't think she does this by chance.